Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight is a book review, and I'm very excited to talk about this book. It is one that I read months ago, but I kind of pushed it to the side, knowing at some point I really wanted to review it, and I was kind of in that vibe and thought, you know what, now is the time. Obviously, if you've seen the thumbnail and the description for tonight's show, then you know what I'm talking about. I will be reviewing A Light in the Dark, Surviving More Than Ted Bundy by Kathy Kleiner Rubin and Emily LeBrew Luchesky. I am really excited to talk about this book. There are so many books on Ted Bundy, as we all know. He is one of those classic cases. And I did an interview with Kevin Sullivan a couple of months ago. So if you missed that, check him out and check out that interview. He is very well researched in the Ted Bundy subject. That being said, there aren't many books like Kathy's because there aren't many people who survive serial killers, unfortunately, but Kathy did. So for her to write about her experience as well as things she's gone through in life in this, you're not just going to find this anywhere because, we are all familiar with Ted Bundy. He didn't leave many victims alive. So the fact that Kathy is still alive and survived the attack and can recount it is, again, something you're just not going to get anywhere. So with that being said, I can't wait to talk about this book with you guys. I have a lot to go over, as well as, of course, I will give you my thoughts on the book. But before we dive into that, as I knock it over, let's see who's here. James Watson, hello. Kane, Chris James. Let's see, Danny, there was a monkeys marathon. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. I love that. Well, thank you for thinking of me. I read the book on your recommendation, Danny. Kane, yes, so you've already read this book? Oh my gosh, that makes me really excited. Okay, so when I go through this, by all means, please put your opinions in the chat on this. And I'm really curious your takeaways from it too. Oh my gosh, that makes me really, really happy. We're going to give that a star. All right, let me pick up the book. You'd think one of the cats was in the room and knocked it down, but no, just me. Just me. So I will say I was fortunate enough, and honestly, it was a tremendous honor. And I told this to her when I met her, Kathy Kleiner, when I met her at CrimeCon Orlando last year. So I'm like so excited to talk about this book. I'm like getting tongue-tied. So I was able to see her speak and give her presentation on the book. And then I was able to purchase it at CrimeCon, and I happened to just be walking around and ran into her and her husband. And I told her I went to her presentation and asked her to sign my book, and she was very kind enough to do so. I know I showed this back on my CrimeCon 2023 video, but just go ahead and show that again. So yes, so she did sign the book for me, which made it just super special. But anyway, just my little side note. So for those of you who don't know, Kathy at this point in life is a motivational speaker who specializes in survivor impact. The book itself is 287 pages. There are some pictures in here, but very little. With that being said, not a single picture of Ted Bundy, which is amazing. This is about Kathy. This book is about Kathy and her story and her journey. So the pictures that are in here are of herself, of her husband, her son, some of the pictures from when she pledged and joined the Chi Omega at FSU sorority. So again, just a few pictures kind of sprinkled here and there, not a single one of Ted Bundy. And I can't stress how important that is, as well as how deliberate that is. We've all seen his picture. We all know what he looks like. We don't need to see it anymore. And again, this is about Kathy, and I'm glad that she didn't put a single picture in here because it doesn't need to be. There does not need to be any pictures of Ted. So if you buy this thinking, oh, I'm going to see pictures of Ted Bundy in it, nope, you're not, which is a good thing. So Let's see. Chris James, do you have any aspirations to write a book? No, because there's nothing I can really contribute to any subject. So I joke the only book I would ever write is like a Danny After Dark exclusive, behind the scenes, what it's like to work with Paul and Beckham from Manson Saga discussion panel. That would be like my tell-all book. Other than that, nah. Very good book, very well written. I agree with that, King. I absolutely agree with that. So there are some things that y'all know me and my notes. I have quite a bit of notes here that I pre-typed up just because I didn't want to be like looking this way as I talk about it. Some parts I'm going to be doing a little bit of a recap about the book, just so you guys get a good feel for it. And then from there, I will be doing some actual quoting from the book. Again, if I feel like it's important to what I want to relay here in regards to my book review. So the back of the book, just to give you guys the back cover of, if this is a book you're interested in purchasing, which I hope you do, you'll get an idea of what you're in for. So it says, in January 1978, I slept in my bed at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University as Ted Bundy stalked nearby. He grabbed an oak log from a stack of firewood, slipped through a back door with a broken padlock, and headed upstairs. He began twisting doorknobs. Room 9 was open, and he quietly and quickly killed one of my sleeping sorority sisters. Across the hall, he found another unlocked door and murdered again. Then he turned the knob to my bedroom and found it open. I remember the attack vividly. Bundy bashed me once in the head. Let's see. All right. Technical difficulties. Oh my goodness. Okay. As I was in the middle of that, such an important part too. All right, let me see. My camera disconnected, but I can see that the volume is still working, which is awesome. So let's get that. Oh, no, there we go. Sorry about that, folks. All right. We're good here. We're good here. All right. No, you know what the problem is? You know when your computer says, hey, do this update, and you're like, yeah, later. Yeah, that was one of those moments where it's like, no, just a reminder, do your update. All right. Anyway, sorry about that. So where was I? So yes, he turned the knob to Kathy's bedroom and found it was open. I remember the attack vividly. Bundy bashed me once in the head with the log and then attacked my roommate. He heard me moaning and came to finish me off. He never let his victims live, but he stopped suddenly. When a bright light filled the room, he fled the sorority house and the light disappeared. This is my story of surviving 3 death sentences and finding love and happiness along the way. I was saved by a bright light, and I hope my story is for people who are experiencing their own dark times. I am a victim, but I am also a survivor. He has become a legend, and our voices have been silenced. It's time we are heard. That description on the back is 100% accurate to the content that you would be reading in the book. And I like how in that description, especially towards the bottom of it, she does not say his name. She just says he. He has become a legend, and our voices have been silent. It's time we are heard. I really think that last part is extremely strong and powerful and impactful. So the book itself is in memory of all of the women and girls whose lights were extinguished by Ted Bundy. The preface of the book, it goes a little bit more into detail about that. I was debating whether or not to just kind of read the whole thing or just read a part of it, because I wanted to keep it in Kathy's words because it's such a powerful way to begin the book. So I did make notes on a part of it that I did want to read again because I think it does a great job of giving a bit of why his case is so, I hate to say, well-known and historical and, you know, one of those kind of top cases when you think of true crime and serial killers. But again, this is Kathy's words as to why. And I find it very impactful when she does that. So What she says in the preface is Bundy's story has been told countless times in books, documentaries, and television series. But what about the victims? What about the stories of the dozens of women and girls who were murdered by this monster? Where was their story? It couldn't be found in the fading newspaper articles. Reporters typically had several hundred words to inform readers about Bundy's arrest, trial, or execution. The victims' quotes or statements by their families were trimmed down to mere sentences. And the amount of misinformation in these clippings was staggering. Most newspapers reported that I didn't remember the attack and insinuated that I had nothing to say. That was not the truth. I remember the attack vividly. I still remember, all these years later, attending the deposition at the trial. I can distinctly recall the day he was finally put to death. Victims like me have a story to tell. My story is painful and violent, but I'm a survivor. I endured childhood lupus, survived Ted Bundy, and withstood early onset breast cancer. Now I want people to remember the Bundy victims who are not here to speak their truth. These victims have become numbers. Their entire lives have been reduced to the times and places where they were murdered. I know there is so much more to their life stories, just as there is more to mine. And so I tell my story on behalf of the dozens of Bundy victims who cannot speak for themselves. All the popular Bundy narratives have pushed these women into the shadows and made them secondary to the demon who killed them. My hope is that my story shines a light into the space that has been too dark for too long. I have chills after reading that. I have absolute chills. It's just, I don't know how else to describe it, but for me, just reading that, it's just so emotional because nobody can read this for the most part and say, I understand what she's saying. You can't. Most people cannot. Again, are there some people who did survive a similar type of predator? Yes, but there's not many. So to read that, it just, again, to me, it's just very emotional, very powerful, and honestly, just completely just gives me chills. So as the preface describes, Kathy, right in that, gives basically the 3 death sentences that she's referring to in regards to the childhood lupus, as well as the Ted Bundy attack, and then her surviving early onset breast cancer later on in life. So right up front, the reader gets those 3, again, death sentences that she had to overcome. So before I jump into giving you guys a little bit of a summary of the book, I just want to see where you guys are in the chat, as well as just take a sip of water because it's going to be one of those long book reviews. So let's begin with that. Okay, let's see. All right. Okay, you guys are wondering about the bright light. Well, just continue listening and you'll find out more, James Watson. All right. So the book starts right away with Kathy's health when she was 12 years old. She was slowly dying and doctors didn't know why. She was tired all the time, physically, and continued to decline health-wise. She was hospitalized and her family tried to prepare as best they could because, again, the doctors didn't know, and it was almost like prepare for the worst. Really, they thought she was just going to be having not many months left to live, to be completely honest. So ultimately, she was diagnosed with systemic lupus. Lupus diagnoses, again, are very, very different now than they were back then. So I know people might hear that now and think, oh, well, yes, it is a horrific thing to be diagnosed this, but there are so many treatments. Back then, that really wasn't the case, especially with somebody as young as Kathy was at the time. Again, she was only 12 years old. So Kathy's family was connected to Dr. Marta Teresita Levestida. I think I pronounced that right. She was doing experimental chemo treatment and it was offered to Kathy. So her family discussed this and the decision was made to go ahead and do that to try to save her life. So she started chemotherapy in 1970. Kathy describes the experiences that she had with going through chemotherapy as a 12-year-old girl. She remembers what it was like for her physically and describes that, what it was like emotionally for her. She went to group meetings with other people who were diagnosed with lupus, but they were mostly older women. And those who had it at that point, it was much more progressive, their diagnosis, and they were basically women who were dying. So they were kind of at the end stage of that, where Kathy, again, was just a 12-year-old child attending these meetings, which I can't even imagine what that is like. She doesn't go too in depth in regards to that, but she gives just enough where you kind of get the gist what that was like for her to experience that at such a young age. As we know what happens with chemotherapy, Kathy ended up losing her hair and she had to stay home from school. She couldn't go out and play with the other kids because she was so autoimmune compromised. She talks about all of the medication she had to take, but most importantly, she talks about how lonely she was at home during the day. She was home all day because, again, she couldn't go outside. She describes, and oh my gosh, and this is just so sad. She describes the story of several times calling the operator. For those of you who are younger and you're thinking, gee, what are you talking about, an operator? Y'all know. For those of us who are older, you know. So she would call the operator just to engage and maybe have somebody to talk to. Sometimes the operators were kind and would stay on the line and talk with her for a little bit. And sometimes they would say, we're busy, we just can't talk to you. But that was a way for her to have some type of human connection. Sometimes the operators, again, would have to let her go. So at that point, again, she had no outside or really no inside, for the most part, contact besides her immediate family. Once she tried to go outside and convince her mom to take her to church, and that was a big deal. Not even 2 weeks later, she caught shingles. So as that summer progressed, the doctor told Kathy's mother it was finally safe for her to enter the public and be let out of isolation. They had learned that chemotherapy had suppressed her immune system and the attack on her body had stopped, so she had gone into remission. She had now survived her first death sentence. Kathy then goes on to describe her family in the book in detail: her father, her mother, her siblings. Sadly, Kathy's father passed away when she was young, and she describes that story in the book. And it is just so sad to hear any child that young recount losing such a close family member, especially their father. But again, she goes into that. And that was one of the stories that she'd gone over when I saw her at CrimeCon. She spoke about that experience. And that was one that just kind of really stuck out to me because it was just such a sad moment for a child. Kathy's mother, however, did go on to remarry a guy named Harry Kleiner. And you can tell how much of an amazing person Harry was. And he stepped in completely to the role of father for Kathy. He was the one who would take care of her through her hardships in the years to come. And again, completed an extremely important role in her life. Well, Kathy would go on to graduate high school, and when it was time to consider colleges, she applied to Florida State University. Her high school friend Susie had gone there and was actually in the sorority there, Chi Omega. Kathy is really funny in the book in describing why she wanted to go to Florida State University. She lived with a traditional Cuban mother who was very, I don't want to say, very protective. Was very protective, I'll put it that way. And Kathy never describes that as a bad thing. It was just that's the way her mother was. And her mom, again, growing up with a condition like lupus, her mom, very protective mama bear type of thing. And now it's time for Kathy to kind of go away to school. And Kathy recounts wanting to go there because it was the furthest she could get away from her parents, but still pay in-state tuition, which is funny. So she states, and what she did not realize when she applied to FSU was she was, going through that application process, proofreading her application. It would one day be copied and put into a police file as part of a victim profile. All right, let's just check the chat. Well, hi, Paul. Good to see you. Not sure why you're here, but it's all good. It's all good. So, all right, at this point in the book, this is where Kathy does get into a bit about Ted Bundy and his life, his background, growing up with his family, and several of the murders prior to the Chi Omega attack that occurred. Again, when this was happening and Ted Bundy was traveling and committing all his crimes, Kathy wasn't aware of it because, again, totally different state. The media back then was not like it was now. And one of the things that we know now, looking back, is police departments, not only within the same kind of area, but different counties, but especially across states, information like that wasn't really shared. So Kathy's going on, kind of living her life, applying for college, getting in FSU, and kind of going through all of that kind of life journey experiences. And meanwhile, Ted is on the hunt, committing the crimes that he is. So while this book goes on in chronological order of describing Kathy and where she is in life and kind of going through that steps leading us up to the Chi Omega attacks, it also intertwined talks about Ted Bundy, his attacks, and the victims he attacked at that time. So those kind of coincide throughout. So just so you have a little bit of perspective on that. And it's, again, hindsight, reading how she's going through life as this is happening and how Ted is committing his crimes and where they're going to intersect. It's just, as a reader reading that, it's just, you're on pins and needles. And I actually had a knot in my stomach reading it because even though I knew what was about to come, it's just, again, in hindsight, it's like, oh my gosh, she's just doing what any normal young college student is, moving away from home, pledging a sorority, having the time of her life. And meanwhile, she has no idea what's about to hit, and that will change the course of her life forever. So, Mr. Beckham. Hey, Beckham, thank you for joining. So, what makes this book different? And again, I know, Kane, I know you've read this, and so by all means, again, give your opinion on this. Kathy goes into, as she says at the beginning of the book in her preface, as well as at the back cover of the book, she goes into detail on each of the women, each of his victims. And this is very purposeful. What she has found in other true crime books is not only is the victim section mentioned in maybe a paragraph, that's not a paragraph per victim. That's usually just a paragraph clumping all of these victims into one, which is really a tragedy and just a slap in the face, honestly, to those who ultimately suffered at the hands of such a heinous person. So Kathy devotes time to describing each of the women, the lives that they had. They were people, and she wants that to be known in this. And I have to commend her on it because you don't see that in other books. Not just about the Ted Bundy case, but really about true crime in general. You don't really see that. And the fact that she did that, I think, again, makes her stand out alone in her book for this. Let's see. Okay. So Kathy goes on to describe her now getting into college, moving into FSU. She lived her first year in the dorms, and she also applied and rushed the Chi Omega house. I mentioned her high school friend Susie had gone to FSU and pledged and was a Chi Omega sorority sister. So that is, again, one of the reasons why she pledged Chi Omega. Kathy was accepted into the house and became an official sister of the sorority. Hey, Tony. Good to see you. Welcome. So Kathy talks about what she wanted to do in college in regards to majoring. And it kind of goes back and forth between a few majors, which I think a lot of us can relate to when we went to college. I personally can't relate to that only because I knew I always wanted to go to school for psychology, but I have so many friends and family, and then just people you meet at college that, they're trying a few different things and trying a few different majors to see what grabs their interest. And that's what's so important about that first year of college, because you have to take kind of all those electives and get that out of the way. And that's just so common for most people to do, and just kind of see what really calls to them, what speaks to them. And then that's kind of what they go on to do. So Kathy at one point describes how she wanted to be an anthropologist. And she talks about this really funny story of she didn't realize it involved so much digging and sweeping aside soil with their hands. So she talks about how she went out in the field. Again, she started her major in this. She had just gotten a manicure done and is doing what you're supposed to do. And she says, quote, "Oh my God, this job is too physical," end quote, and looks at her hands and realizes her freshly done manicure is ruined. So she switched majors after that, which I think is just so funny. Hey, Craig. Hey, hon. Good to see you. So Kathy meets a gentleman named Simon, a boy from South Florida. Simon is a pseudonym in this book, so that is not his actual real name, but that is what she refers to him as throughout this entire book. So again, we're just going to say Kathy developed a relationship with Simon. So at the end of Kathy's freshman year, her parents would insist that she move into the sorority house her sophomore year. They felt that this would be safer for her. It was a home where there was a house mother. There were a lot of sisters there. It was well locked, and, meaning all of the different entrances and exits that they had each had their own lock. So it was something that her parents felt, this is the best thing to be safe for our daughter to be at. Kathy's mother, again, being overprotective as she was, spoke to somebody at Chi Omega and was able to get Kathy to move into the sorority house there her sophomore year. The way Kathy kind of describes it, it seems like it's kind of by rank in regards to the upperclassmen get to move there and live there. So Kathy ordinarily wouldn't have been able to move in her sophomore year, is the gist that you get from this. But her mom pulled some strings. She doesn't know how she did it. But ultimately, Kathy was able to live at the Chi Omega house her sophomore year. How come people never call Paul charming or beautiful? Because no one wants to lie, James. Sorry, Paul Cass, if you're still here, which I know he's not. So by all means, go for it, James. So Kathy talks about, at this point, all the exciting things that are going to be happening now that she's moving into the sorority house. That includes things like, I can remember this personally, going shopping for, a new bedroom items, a new comforter, new sheets, like all those kind of really cool things that you get to buy for going away at college and kind of setting your room up as your own, that freedom, you're out of your parents' home. So she describes that, and just, you really feel it in the book that, like, she's like, this is going to be such an amazing time. I'm going to be living in the house, living with my sorority sisters, and I get to set up my room my way. She did have a roommate, and Kathy and her roommate both like plants. So what they decided was to hang the plants up kind of in the window and leave the curtains open all the time. And that is an important part of this story. So it's such a small detail that you never thought it would be something that would come up later, but it plays such a big role in this case. And that their back window faced the back parking lot. So anytime a sorority sister was dropped off, it would usually be at the back of the house. So just keep that in mind. So Kathy, again, now living in the sorority house with her roommate, she talks about a specific day. A day where she went to a wedding for a couple that was getting married in a part of the local church that Kathy joined and belonged to, which was right near her sorority house. So after that wedding, because it was an afternoon wedding, she went home that night, and she was going to go out again, but ultimately decided she was tired and would stay in and just kind of study. Kathy's roommate that night also decided to stay home and study. And when I say stay home, I mean in their sorority house. Ultimately, after a night of studying, they decided to go to bed. So Kathy describes during the course of that night, again, while she's studying, other sorority sisters kind of talking about their plans, making plans, coming and going, who went out, who stayed, so on and so forth. Just your everyday life at a sorority house. What Kathy and her sorority sisters never could have imagined was that Ted Bundy was nearby at a bar called Sherrod's. He had been there watching the women dance. He was clearly very out of place at this point. If anybody has kind of followed this case, then you know at this point of his crime spree, should I say, he was basically unraveling. That's just my way of saying it. He didn't look the same. He looked disheveled, tired, as opposed to the Ted Bundy who kind of first started his attacks, was very charming, so on and so forth. So very different vibe at this point. And again, when you go to a college bar, you're going to know if somebody's, yes, there are grad students nearby, and grad students are a bit older than, let's say, a sophomore in college, right? But he was much older, so it stood out even more. So he was at this point, again, very disheveled, but much older. So it made him stand out quite distinctly. He noticed that the back door to the Chi Omega house easily swung open. So remember how Kathy's parents wanted her to live there because it was so secure? The keypad lock that Kathy's parents had put so much trust in, that padlock was recently broken, and it had been for days. So sisters were able to kind of come and go without a key. It was just open. So Kathy then describes Ted Bundy's movements in the house from once he enters the Chi Omega house, who he attacked first, how he attacked them, and then so on and so forth in chronological order. So as we know, Kathy was asleep as those attacks occurred. So she's just reciting it from, again, the information she has read on or heard of from that, whether it is through the case, through the court, whatnot. We all know this story, but she is now telling it from her perspective. And she can give a different insight into this because this wasn't, books are referred to, he went into the Chi Omega house, he went to this room, this room, this room. She lived there. So from going bedroom to bedroom, she can describe it in a way that really no other author can, because most authors haven't been there. She lived there. So it's just a different experience reading it from her perspective. So I just want to make sure that is known to everybody. So Kathy remembers for her bedroom, she hears the bedroom door open as it pushed across the carpet. It slightly woke her, but not fully. Then she heard the sound of somebody tripping over a small trunk. Her and her roommate had that small trunk in between their beds. And that crashing sound of somebody, again, bumping into that trunk woke her up. When she woke up, she saw a figure. He raised his left arm in the air. He had a log in his hand, and he slammed that log onto her face with tremendous force. And that is her words describing that. I will not go into detail about that attack. She describes it vividly, extremely detailed. She does not leave anything out. That honestly, for me, was the hardest part to read because, again, this is nothing where you can read and think, I know what she's talking about. You don't. None of us know what she experienced in that. I will leave you with the one part that really, it just was so sad to read, where, again, read it for yourself. But she talks about where she's screaming for help. She's screaming for help, but no sound is coming out. All that is happening is there is gurgling sounds of blood in her mouth as she's desperately gasping for air. Again, hardest part in the book for me to read, but she goes into it in extreme detail. So Kathy was not the only one attacked in that bedroom. Kathy's roommate was also attacked. So he started to attack Kathy's roommate. Goes back to Kathy because at this point she's still alive. And as we know, Bundy did not keep a victim alive. So he went to Kathy Kleiner to finish her off. He went to raise that log, and suddenly he was frozen in the light. A car had pulled into the back lot to drop off one of the sorority sisters. At that point, Bundy spooked because now the light is shining in on him and he thinks he's been seen. So he flees the room and disappears. So for those of you, again, who are familiar with the case, know that Nita Neri, sorority sister, arrived home, and she was able to come in the house and see Bundy coming down the stairs. She got a view of him from the side, like a side profile, when he crossed the foyer and went out of the door. The thing is, men weren't allowed on that second floor of the sorority house, so she knew something was off. Again, could it have been a boyfriend kind of sneaking over and whatnot? Could have, but she instinctively knew something wasn't right. Kathy's roommate, again, who was also attacked, she also survived the attack. And somehow she was able to get up and stagger into the hallway and saw Nita Neri along with another sorority sister, Nancy. So it took Nita and Nancy a second to process what was going on because, again, Kathy's roommate who stumbles into the hall, she's clearly been attacked, blood everywhere. So Nita and Nancy go look in Kathy's bedroom. And what Kathy recalls them saying is, quote, "God help her," end quote. So Kathy describes then that all of a sudden the room is filled with people, police, and she feels relieved actually that the police are there because she knows whoever just attacked her is not going to come back. She is guarded. She feels safe. She was taken outside in a stretcher and she reached the front door and she describes she felt a cold blast of frigid air. She says emergency personnel were looking down at her in the stretching and all she could think is, quote, what are you looking at, end quote. In Kathy's mind, because of the lights, the sirens, the sounds, in her mind, we hear about this all the time where people just disassociate just out of self-preservation in a horrific experience. In her mind, she was at a carnival. With all the lights, the sirens, the sounds, she thought she was at a carnival. So that's where her mind went to. County Sheriff Ken Casares was there that night and watched her on the stretcher. Law enforcement was trying to account for every single other sorority sister. It was at this point that they, again, kind of counting who was here, who's not, who went away home, who's maybe out, went to see their boyfriend, family, whatnot, whatever. At this point, police discover Lisa Levy. She has been attacked and is deceased. Margaret Bowman. She has been attacked. She is deceased. Kathy, again, goes into great detail about that. The thing is, Kathy didn't know at the time, and law enforcement did not know immediately at the time, but the law enforcement would soon find out that Ted Bundy had struck again that same night just a few streets away. He attacked Cheryl. She was a dance major who would come home after an evening out with friends. And Cheryl's roommates ultimately heard noises that again, something wasn't quite right. So they had a system in place where if something was wrong to call the other one, and they called Cheryl, she didn't pick up. So they called the police. And ultimately, that saved her life because Bundy fled. So Kathy was at the hospital, and one of the nurses that was there that night that attended to her was actually the bride from the wedding that she went to that earlier that day. So the bride was actually still in nursing school and was doing a rotation on the emergency floor. Kathy describes her as when the friend, again, the just married bride, kind of had her fingers on Kathy's forehead. She describes it as gentle fingers on her forehead. Her tension was gone. Now she wasn't alone. So seeing her friend also was the last thing she saw before she went into surgery. So let's see where you guys are in the chat. I know I've been talking quite a bit about this. Let's see. Hey, Wolf, she's an extremely tough person. Oh my God, you're absolutely spot on. And yet at the same time, it's like such an understatement. She never completely lost consciousness. No. Well, she talks about fading in and out, but she seems to be more aware than not. But there were some moments where she does say in the book that she was in and out. But for the most part, again, aware of who was there, who was looking at her, and who was attending to her. So let's see. Yes, Wolf. So Kathy describes the various surgeries that she had as a result of this attack. Within a few days, she was moved from intensive care into a private room. Kathy was going to go home with her parents to try to now begin the recovery from such a brutal attack. So she was going to leave school and go back with her family. Prior to that, again, Kathy was under constant surveillance from the police. They didn't want whoever had attacked her to come back because at this point it was completely unknown who did the attack in the sorority house. Kathy described she was about to go home, but the police first brought her to the Chi Omega house. They needed her to return to her room and look to see if anything was out of place. This was important because police weren't sure if it was a robbery. Could that have been the motive? Did the attacker steal anything of value? So they wanted her to look and to see. And Kathy describes this again in great detail of the police officers helping her from the car, walk her up to the sorority house. And she describes these beautiful stairs that go up to that second floor in the sorority house where her bedroom was. She couldn't walk them alone. She was just brutally attacked. So she had a police officer on each arm and slowly, one step at a time, made her way up those stairs. Her description of experience this, it like makes me choked up just to think about her having to do that she was at such a point, but it was also really needed at the time for the investigation. So she goes up those stairs with the police officers. She sees Margaret's bedroom door. She sees Lisa's bedroom door and her bedroom door. All three are blocked with yellow crime scene tape. She didn't know anything happened to anybody else in the house besides her and her roommate. She was still so foggy, was under painkillers, medications, so she didn't quite make the connection that other people in the house were attacked. Especially, again, Margaret and Lisa. She had no idea, still at this point, that they were attacked. So it actually wasn't until weeks later that she actually learned about Margaret Bowman's attack and death, as well as Lisa Levy's attack and death. And instead of death, their murder. So as she says, quote, "We paused in front of my room so the police officer could remove the yellow crime scene tape. I stood in the doorway and confronted the scene in front of me. Our room was a snapshot of suffering. There was blood streaks and splatters on the walls and floor. Both of our beds were drenched in blood that had spilled from our heads. My beloved comforter, that green and white cover with trees, was crusted in brown, dried blood. I stared at the comforter and considered the massive stain. It came from the blood that poured from my mouth and dripped from my face. I remembered the way it tasted and how my nearly severed tongue flailed in my mouth. This really happened to me, I thought. None of this was imagined. The room shocked me. This was where the man I had never met before in my life used an oak log and tried to pummel me to death. This was where he held up the log for a second time while I braced myself and waited to die. This is where the beautiful white light shone through our windows and saved us. It was horrifying, but I think I needed to see it to understand that what I experienced was true, as confirmed by the bloodstains on my comforter. I would never have to wonder what the room looked like after we were attacked. I would never have to question myself when I revisited the attack in my mind." End quote. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Can't even imagine. So Kathy, again, moves back in with her parents to recover from this attack. Kathy's mother, again, very protective mama bear, didn't want Kathy to kind of read in the paper, see on TV what was going on. She didn't want to upset her with anything about what was happening. Ultimately, with what we would learn, and she would learn, the public would learn, the world would learn what was happening with Ted Bundy. Anything related to the attacks, or Ted, once he became known as he was the one that committed this attack, was cut out of the newspaper before that newspaper was then given to Kathy. Kathy described, and this is so sad too. This is so, so sad. She describes how she would call the sorority house 3 to 4 times. She wanted to talk to her sisters. She wanted to be reassured that she did nothing wrong. Again, when you join a sorority or a fraternity, these are supposed to be, sisters, brothers that are supposed to be there, you essentially for the rest of your life. This is what you're pledging into. No one ever called her back. No one. So Kathy's jaw was even wired to let her heal because, again, she was brutally attacked. So it was actually quite an effort for her to be able to kind of speak through those wires in the first place. And again, no one called her back. Kathy never heard from the Chi Omega leadership. She never heard from national officers, and she felt that they could have done better. Absolutely. Absolutely. She kept wanting for someone to reach out. No one ever did. Kathy goes on now at this point in the book to describe the last attack Bundy did, and that was on 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. So she goes into detail on that and ultimately how he was captured after that. She talks quite a bit about Ken Casares. He was the Leon County Sheriff, and he was a young man, just 39 years old at this time, and was filled with energy and determination. Ken took this case very personally. He had been at that Chi Omega house that night within minutes of the attack. If you remember early on in this review, I mentioned him. He was there. When Kathy was taken out in the stroller, he was one of the people that was there, looked down and saw her. The injuries that Kathy and her roommate who survived sustained were so profound. He honestly thought they weren't going to make it. So Ken, realizing and learning who Ted Bundy was and how we all know Ted Bundy didn't escape just once, he escaped twice. That second escape is why he made it to Florida. Ken was going to make sure that Ted Bundy was not going to escape, not on his watch. So he made Ted Bundy wear leg brace so he couldn't run away like he did so many other times in the past. What Ted Bundy didn't realize was he finally met his match with Ken Casares. Meanwhile, Kathy's recovering at home. Mental health treatment, however, very different now than it was then. But Kathy also had a very old school Cuban mother. And her view was you never spoke to a therapist. You didn't talk about it. You deal with it. So Kathy never went to therapy over what happened. She talks about, in regards to recovering, she talks about recovering from her jaw operations, which she still has to have to this day, every so many years because of what happened. So Kathy goes on to describe how she developed a fear of unfamiliar men. So she decided to confront this head on. And this is one of those things that when you read about what Kathy went through, you wouldn't blame her or think twice if she, some people would just kind of fade back and kind of ball up with their emotions and just kind of, everybody processes things different, but you wouldn't be surprised if it went the other way. But Kathy, no. She wants to take this head on. So what she realized is she has this fear now of unfamiliar men. She needs to attack it head on. And so she got a job at a lumberyard. She wanted to be somewhere in her mind that she felt would expose her to a lot of unfamiliar men. So that's what she did. She's so funny. Throughout this book, you get these moments of these like laughable little, statements that she makes that, you're reading this and you're in shock and you're upset. to say some of the parts in the book are upsetting, yeah, it's such a sad account, but then she adds these little nuggets in there where you just kind of chuckle and you're like, oh my gosh, she just views things in such a positive way where she can just take things and flip it to a totally different direction. So she jokes about how what she learned was, for the most part, men are nice, and that men who go to lumber yards are pretty cute. So after about a month, she got over that. And I think that's hilarious. And I'm just like, well, good for her. Good for you, girl. So she developed another aversion. Hospitals. Makes sense. So she recognized this again, didn't want to be held back by anything. So she walked into a hospital and took a job as a buyer. So every day she had to battle this head on. She would drive to the parking lot, park her car, walk into the hospital, walk into the lobby, go up to administrations, and sit at her desk every day. And that's what got her over her aversion and fear of hospitals. So Kathy, in the meantime, is still with her boyfriend, Simon. They never returned to Florida State University. So in the early part of that following spring, Simon proposed to Kathy. And looking back, she says they were too young to get married. Not only that, her parents and his thought this was the best thing for both of them. It would help Kathy recover. He lacked direction. So this is the perfect thing. The wedding, Kathy's mom planned the whole thing. Again, looking back, she says we should not have gotten married. It wasn't the right time in her life. She had so much of the attack that she had to process and heal from on her own. And learning the details now about who attacked her. She's now at that point where she's learning more about Ted Bundy. So before I continue, let's see. Kathy had amazing insights into how to help herself. Oh my gosh, absolutely, absolutely. I must say, again, just those little moments in the book where you kind of chuckle. I was just you just think because when you're reading the book at a certain point, it takes you back to, at least for me, when she's talking about that college experience and she's describing going shopping for this and that. I'm like, I remember doing that. I remember being that age and doing those things and feeling that way. It brought all that back. So it's you feel for me personally, I feel like I connected with her on those levels of those emotions. And then again, things go sideways. But when she talks about, again, going to that lumber yard, I'm just like, well, dang, if, I would have been there to help you, girl. I would have gone to work with you there. You know what? I'm here to help you. But yeah, just those funny little moments that she has. But yeah, it just goes on to, there are so many parts in this book where you see where, again, not every person could take things up and confront them the way she did. But the way when things present themselves, she just head on. And she's like that through everything. And as the book goes on, you see her, confront each obstacle as it comes. But it's just, again, amazing insight that she has. Absolutely, Kane. Very, very well said. So Kathy, again, she just got married. And she was beginning to understand not only had she survived an attack from a serial killer, because now they're learning, again, police are learning, she's learning, this was just not somebody who did a one-off attack on a sorority house. This is somebody who is a serial killer, and she survived. She also didn't quite know what that meant. So another heartbreaking thing for Kathy, she got engaged, getting married to Simon. She reflects back on her wedding and says she sent an invitation to the sorority house for a wedding. And she was later told that invitation was hung up in the telephone room of the sorority house. She hoped her sisters would RSVP. She hoped they would attend. No one acknowledged the invitation. Technically, the only Chi Omega sister who did attend her wedding was her friend Susie, who she was friends with already from high school. That was the only person. So not only did her sisters not show up to the wedding, no one RSVP'd to even say they weren't going to go. So here she is thinking, it's my wedding day. Maybe I'll get to see my sorority sisters. No. And that's so heartbreaking. So heartbreaking. So at this point, Kathy discusses that she had to testify before the grand jury. As we know in regards to other true crime cases that I've talked about, it isn't quite like it is on TV. It's not like, okay, the person's captured, now there's a trial and we're all watching it on TV and there's a verdict and so on and so forth. No. There's a lot of steps that happen prior to that. One of this was testifying before the grand jury. This is where she got to see her old sorority roommate, the roommate who also survived the attack. First time they saw each other since this attack. They get to see each other quickly, but again, you don't really talk about the case because it's going to ultimately go to trial. So Kathy discusses what it was like to testify in that small room behind the judge's chambers in front of all the attorneys. This is the first time she actually saw Ted Bundy. She says she stated that she stared at him the whole time, never broke her gaze. She wanted to be viewed as the person in power, but Ted Bundy gave off an attitude, that one of those where it just oozes, why am I here? This is a waste of my time. I'm bored. That's the vibe he gave. Again, Kathy, however, wanted to be presented as a position of power, never breaking gaze with him. Kathy describes Ken Casares, for those of you who know this case, remember the dental impression that Ken got the warrant to get that from Ted Bundy's mouth, the impression of his teeth, because he bit Lisa Levy on her buttocks. And they wanted to identify that bite mark with Ted's because Ted had very distinctive teeth. And that was very, very new. That was the first time someone got a warrant for somebody's mouth. So Kathy describes that process in the book because we all know how that went, and we've all seen that, and I call it infamous video, where Ted Bundy steps off the elevator and is stunned that there's a press conference and there's Ken Casares reading the indictment. If you've not seen that, look it up on YouTube. You will find it very, very easily. You just watch Ted, because he steps off the elevator and I get no idea what was about to hit him. And he's very arrogant, talks over Ken, but Ken Casares just very in control, reading the indictment. It's such one of those standout moments for people who know the Ted Bundy case. So if you have not seen it, check that footage out for sure. Let's see. Kane is saying, I think people think bad luck or bad things will follow them if they are with the victim. No, I know what you meant. Kathy didn't quite go into this in her book, but she talked about it at the presentation that I went to at CrimeCon, as well as other interviews that she does in regards to her book. She discusses the story of the sorority sisters. What she learned was that, the kind of head of the sorority, I don't know the technical terms of that. I was not a sorority girl. But they advised the girls to not talk to Kathy. It was just kind of, let's just basically ice her out, ignore her, and she will kind of fade into the background and go away. They didn't want the sorority to suffer. They didn't want people to not pledge the sorority, because think about it. There's money to be made. Sororities and fraternities, there's money to be made. And they didn't want what happened to impact that. So here you get all these, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old girls they don't quite know any better. They're being told, don't do this. They're scared. They also are impacted by this, not at the same level as Kathy was or her roommate, certainly Margaret or Lisa, but this was an attack on their sorority, their home where they lived. So they're impressionable. Yes, it got to a point where they could look back and say, wait a minute, this is wrong. And they could have righted that wrong, but they didn't. So yeah. And I can see that my Wi-Fi is kind of jitting in and out. So I apologize if the video quality goes a little off during this. My apologies. Paul, can you just put something into the comments as to like what I'm here discussing? Good to see you, buddy. So again, for those of you who don't know this scene that I'm talking about, I'll kind of lay it out. So Ken Casares remained calm, read the indictment to the press. When he reads the charge against Ted Bundy for beating Kathy in the head, go back and watch it if you missed this. I had to go, I've seen this clip, I can't even tell you how many times, but I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't catch this moment. You go back and catch it. Oh, for Christ's sakes. So when Ken Casares reads the charge for beating Kathy in the head, he says her name in the alleged crime of the attempted murder. Bundy smiles. He smiles as Kathy's name is read, and he actually chuckles when Bundy hears, so Ted chuckles when he hears Ken say, quote, knowingly cause great bodily harm, end quote, which is like, there are no words. There are no words. It was evident to Bundy that the victims didn't exist. He was not sorry for them. And he was not sorry that he murdered or attempted to murder as many women as he did. Again, the indictments were what happened in Florida. This was not a list of indictments in regards to all of his victims from any of the other states. So again, I just want to make sure that's clear. So before Ted Bundy's actual trial began, Kathy talks about she's now moving on with her life. So it's now the summer of 1978. She and Simon were now married, living in a 2-bedroom house in Boca Raton, Florida. She had a job as a bank teller. She discusses one day, she's at work, and a man comes into the bank and goes up to her line, holds up a gun, and wants to rob them. So before Kathy could take the cash out of the drawer in this robbery, the robber sees over Kathy's shoulder to a window. It was the drive-through window. And there was a police car that was actually pulling through at that same time. So the robber gets spooked and runs out. Kathy doesn't realize that there was a police officer going through the drive-through, and she thinks she scared him away. And she's all, yeah, look what I did. And then she learned, oh no, it wasn't me. But just really funny, that moment. Hey, tennis girl, good to see you. Let's see. Hey, Renee. Let's see. Glad I got to say, even if I'm on the tail end of the show, football camp. No worries. Thank you for joining, Renee. Good to see you as always. So, again, Kathy thinking she scared away the robber, but and it's just such a funny moment that she describes that, because you know what? If Kathy was the one that scared him off, I wouldn't have read that and thought, gee, that doesn't sound right. I'd be like, she's a badass in the best way possible. I could see that. But so in the meantime, and this is so tragic too, this I did not know until I read Kathy's book. So one of the sorority sisters at the time, who was a Chi Omega sister when Kathy lived in the home, Valerie Duke, she had been coping with crushing depression after the murders. She had lived in what was bedroom number 7, which was right next to Kathy's room. Valerie actually went home that weekend of the murders, but later learned of the attacks. So she realized that her absence and her being away from home is likely what saved her life, because she wasn't in the sorority house. Because again, we kind of, as you read through this, you read the order of the bedrooms Bundy was attacking, and Valerie's room would have been along that path. So Valerie, having very clear PTSD survivor's guilt, began struggling emotionally. She was highly stressed and ended up dropping out of school on the 1-year anniversary of the Chi Omega attacks. In May 1979, Kathy describes how Valerie sat in her car near Florida River, pointed a gun to her temple, and pulled the trigger. Kathy attributes the suicide of Valerie Duke as being another life claimed by Ted Bundy. And I absolutely agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. Survivor's guilt is such a real thing that, again, this is when these attacks occurred, again, mental health back then, treatment for that and diagnoses totally different than now. So you could see how Valerie was able to kind of spiral the way she did. I don't see how the book doesn't get into, nor does it really need to, because this is Kathy's story, but you can pretty much guarantee, were therapists brought in to speak to the rest of the sisters at the Chi Omega house who did survive, who saw Kathy, who saw her roommate, who saw Lisa, who saw Margaret, all of that. I mean, it's so traumatic. Were they getting the mental health services that they needed? Probably not, because it just wasn't as pressing as it was now. So again, hearing this suicide of Valerie Duke, that was something I didn't know until I read this book. And it's just such a crushing thing. And I absolutely agree with Kathy that this should be another life claimed by Ted Bundy. Let's see where y'all are. Hey, Charlie16, good to see you. Would be nuts to get attacked when you were asleep like she was. Yeah, absolutely. And that was the same with Cheryl, who was a few streets away after the attack at the Chi Omega house. Same thing. She was asleep in her bed and went to school to be a dancer and woke up in the hospital. And that dream was now gone. He took that away from her. No idea. She just had no idea. Yes, Paul, you've talked about that before. And Paul, this is, this episode is not about you. It's not about you, hun, but thank you for sharing your experience. They just gave you a Valium and patted you on the head. Yeah, it was, the fact that Kathy's just, again, I'm looking through this with 2024 goggles on, but the fact that she survived this and didn't see a therapist, it's wow. So Kathy goes back into the book at this point about now she has to give her deposition. So she describes it. They sat in a conference room as they were almost like it was a corporate meeting. And Ted Bundy sat at the head of the table like he was the manager of the meeting. And he didn't come across as the kind of vicious serial killer that we all know him to be. Kathy sat at the other head of the table. She controlled her emotions. She wanted Ted to see that she was in control. He might have done this to her, but she was in control. So now we get to the trial. Kathy didn't follow the trial when it started. Her mother, again, overprotective mama bear, was still cutting out every single article from the paper so that anything related to the trial, anything related to Ted Bundy. So Kathy had no idea what was happening. But her mother saved all of these newspaper clippings in a box, which would ultimately later in Kathy's life, like later, she would then discover these and be able to look back at that. But we all know Kathy testified at trial. And again, this is all online. So if you want to see Kathy's on the stand testifying in Ted's trial, go to YouTube, look it up, you'll find it. So thanks, Paul. If that's not a good co-host, I don't know what is. And again, for those of you who don't know Paulcast, Manson Saga discussion panel, me, Paul, and Mr. Beckham. Yeah, if that's not respecting your co-host, I don't know what is. Thanks, Paul. Oh, absolutely. Ted never, his whole MO, I know this is a bit of a sidetrack, but Kane, you make such an excellent point. I want to expand on that. even a lot of the ways he got his victims was he would wear a fake cast, whether it was, cast on his leg, a sling on his arm, and hey, can you help me get books into my vehicle or whatnot, whatever the ruse was. And then he would attack them from behind. He didn't attack people face to face. If it was face to face, they were asleep. So he was targeting someone who purposely couldn't defend themselves. So it says a lot about him. So again, now we're at the point in the trial Kathy talks about from her perspective. And again, that part is a must read in this book. She talks about her testifying. The prosecutors, the defense, they then give their final statements. I'm not going to get a ton into Kathy's testimony because I want you all to read it for yourself, but she testifies, and then the prosecution and the defense give their final statements, and now it is up to the jury. Well, as we know, Ted Bundy was found guilty as charged for all counts. Ted Bundy, however, he maintained a neutral look on his face as the team of guards surrounded him and led him out of the courtroom. He looked back at his mother and smiled and winked. Louise Bundy, Ted's mother, left the courtroom in tears. She kept telling reporters she couldn't believe it. That's all on video too, so you could go on YouTube and find that. You can see Ted Bundy's mother speaking to the media after he is found guilty. As we know, he then had to go back to the courtroom at a different time for sentencing. So what was recommended to the judge to impose was the electric chair, which is ultimately what he did get sentenced to. Bundy was stone-faced when he heard the recommendation, and he acted oddly dismissive, according to Kathy. As he was led from the courtroom, he smiled at a reporter and said, quote, "See you at the next trial," end quote. Kathy says this lack of remorse is exactly what she expected from Ted Bundy. It is why she wanted to see him brought to justice. He would never be sorry for what he did to Margaret and Lisa, her sorority sisters. He would never be sorry for the other lives he ended or damaged. At this point in the book, Kathy talks a lot about her sorority sisters, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. Again, these were sisters of hers. These were friends of hers. And she was more close with Lisa because Lisa was closer to her age and Margaret was an upperclassman. But again, she was close with both. And she talks about them in great detail. And I'm so thankful for that because as we know from other plethora of information and books, documentaries, so on and so forth about this case, the Chi Omega attacks maybe get a sentence, maybe two. Doesn't get much. All we get is this is who he attacked. These are the victims, and that's it. Margaret Bowman had a life. Lisa Levy had a life, and Kathy wants that known. So she goes into detail about each of her sisters, and I'm so thankful that she did. So if you want to also learn more about these two sorority sisters that ultimately did lose their lives from Ted Bundy, you're going to read about it in this book. So in regards to Kathy's personal life, at this point in her life, Kathy and Simon end up becoming pregnant, and there was going to be a lot of risks for Kathy to have her son because of her health. We know she has lupus. Kathy wanted to be a mother, and there's this in regards to an autoimmune disease. For anybody that's familiar with lupus or any other similar autoimmune diseases, being pregnant can certainly kind of, if something's in remission, bring that back out. Ultimately, Kathy ended up having a healthy baby boy named Michael. Kathy and Simon, early on after having Michael, realized that their marriage just wasn't quite working, so they split up. At this point in life, Kathy was now a single parent, and she was a single parent for the next 5 years of her life. So she talks about now how she is rebuilding her life as a single mom with her son, Michael. She talks about raising him at this point in her life, the struggles of being a single mother. So this one story, and this is going to be one of those, like, if you're a parent, this is one of those like moments that would just make you tear up. Even if you're not a parent, just reading this, you're like, oh my God. So Kathy talks about one night she was putting her son Michael to bed. He put his hands on her face and he felt the scar on her cheek from one of the jaw surgeries that she had had. And he asks her, "How did you get this?" And she said, "A long time ago, an evil man came into my house and he hurt me. That's why we make sure that all of the windows are locked at night." And Michael he takes his hands, grabs Kathy's face and says to her, quote, "I won't let anyone hit you in the face again," end quote. And he's just a little kid when this is said. It's just one of those, oh my God moments. Like, oh my God, she talks about how it's like it wasn't a secret what Ted Bundy did, but she wasn't just offering up that information too. So Michael had no idea. And we're going to get to that later on in the book. But again, at this point, he's just a little kid and he just knows his mom has a scar and overprotective little son over his mom. Just, oh my God, so sad. So Kathy's friend at this point in the book, remember Susie, her high school friend who went to FSU, Chi Omega House, got her into that sorority. Susie was the only friend that technically was a Chi Omega sister that went to their wedding. But again, because they were already established high school friends. Susie ended up dying from a cardiac episode. She wasn't even 30 years old. So now we're at the point in the book where there are services now for Susie who passed away, and Kathy went to the services. She knew that a lot of the Chi Omega sisters were going to be present at that service. And reading the part in this book, like I was so angry for Kathy. I'm reading this thinking, oh no, like I'm ready to go to battle for Kathy over this part in the book. But Kathy just handles everything with such a positive look, but also with class and with dignity. So she, at this point in her life, the sorority sisters hadn't talked to her in years. She, however, still struggled with the fact that they cut her off all those years ago. So she's at the services and the sorority sisters they all just come up to her and they're asking her, "How are you feeling? Kathy, how are you feeling?" Almost like time never passed and like nothing ever happened. And she took this, and Kathy has every right to take it this way, took it very personal because she says it's like she didn't know who they were anymore. Such time has passed and such huge events have happened. She doesn't know them anymore. They don't know her anymore. So their concern seemed fake to her. And she says to them, quote, "I don't need you," end quote, which is, it's like, I needed you then, I don't need you now type of thing. And she just walks off. Such class and dignity for handling that the way she did. She was there for Susie. She was there to help bury her friend. And it's just, because think about it, you lose a friend. It's such a young age for such a tragic thing. I mean, a cardiac episode when you're under 30 years old is just incredible way for someone to pass away, especially someone so close to Kathy. And again, that was the part in the book I was probably the most angry at, because I was thinking, oh, no. She wanted to maintain this friendship. She needed you. Chi Omega sisters. She needed you to reassure her that she was taken away and out of that house. She never went back to FSU. She needed to know she did nothing wrong. She just needed that reassurance, and none of you gave that to her. And now you're just going to go up to her like nothing happened. Oh my God, I was ready to go to battle for Kathy reading this. But she handled it with class. Hey, Corey, good to see you. Hi, Zed, welcome. Reassurance. Great way to describe that. Yes, thank you. Okay, so we are getting there, folks. I know this is a bit of a long book review, but a lot to discuss. So if anybody's coming in here late, and didn't read the description. I am reviewing the book A Light in the Dark, Surviving More Than Ted Bundy by Kathy Kleiner Rubin. So after Susie was buried, at this point in life, Ted Bundy, Kathy learns, is scheduled to die in the electric chair. As we know with the Ted Bundy case, he had many stays of execution. And he really successfully, for a lot of years, I'll just say it, manipulated law enforcement to kind of say, well, like, I'll give you a bit more information if you keep me alive. You know, I can, other victims, like, admit to other victims, so on and so forth. He knew what he was doing. He was smart enough to do that. I think he thought he was smarter than he was. Well, we all know he thought he was the smartest one in the room when he really wasn't. But ultimately, that whole let's drag it along, police are finally like, or law enforcement's like, no, enough. But as we know, it got pushed. His stays of execution. He got stay after stay after stay, which means the victims in this, those who survived, victims' families, law enforcement, had to deal each time with this. Okay, he's finally going to be executed. Nope, there was a stay of execution. Okay, now he's finally going to be executed. Nope, stay of execution. Let's see, Renee says, I remember watching the news and seeing all the people cheering outside the prison when he was executed. Yes, Renee, we're going to get to that. We are going to get to that. But yes, and again, that is on YouTube too. That all of this stuff you guys can go back and watch. And it's very interesting to watch it from this point. Because when he was executed in 89, I was only 5 years old. So, or probably 4.5, because he was executed early 1989. So yeah, I was too young to watch that. I was always into true crime, and my parents let me read and watch true crime, but they weren't letting me watch that. So, all right. So now we are in spring of 1987, and one of Kathy's other high school friends, Betsy, that she's still close with, is at a bar and runs into Scott Rubin. They all went to high school together. Kathy, Scott, and Betsy. He was in theater with Kathy back in high school. And Kathy, now being back in the area, Betsy says, oh, well, Scott, let me get your number and I'm going to give it to Kathy. You guys can reconnect. So Kathy did call Scott Rubin, invited him over for lunch. And she says it was love from the beginning. Basically, he came over for lunch and never left. And what was really important was Kathy's son, Michael, loved Scott from the start. So she talks about that point, you know, him coming into her life and so on and so forth with that, which is just, she deserves happiness. And things are really starting to fall in place with her. She's moving on in life, getting the happiness she so deserves with Scott Rubin. So this part in the book is when Kathy describes the night into the early morning where Ted was finally executed. Ted had tried to get a final stay of execution. It was denied. So Kathy had her son, Michael, because he was still relatively young, pack an overnight bag and stay with her parents so that he was out of the house. So it was just Kathy and Scott who were home at this point. Bundy was going to be heading to the death chamber at sunrise. A prison employee watched Bundy through the window when he was told that his stay of execution was denied. And apparently Bundy's face changed as he learned his life was ending. He was described as being, quote, visibly distraught, end quote. District Attorney Larry Simpson called Kathy to let her know that there was going to be no more stays of execution, and he would be calling her again in the next few hours with another update. And at this point, all Kathy could try to do was just kind of go to bed and sleep and kind of wait for an update. And this is common from back then with what would happen in this case. And Kathy was not the only person that was going to be called with an update. Again, there was other victims' families who were kept in the loop as well. So Kathy's phone rang again at 3:30 in the morning. Larry Simpson called again to say the execution was coming in the next several hours and the prison was prepping the death chamber for Ted. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Kathy and Scott made a pot of coffee and were watching the news coverage because as Renee mentioned, this was live. There were people outside, whether you were pro Ted Bundy being executed or you were against Ted Bundy being executed. Both sides were there. So this was all unfolding live on TV. She says that her and Scott really didn't have much to say as they watched the news. Occasionally, she says they read a sign out loud or pointed to a t-shirt that somebody was wearing with something written on it. She says, quote, "There was nothing to celebrate for those of us close to the case. Lives have been lost and tremendous pain had been inflicted. Bundy's execution chapter, but the grief remained." End quote. So for those of you who are interested in reading the details about Ted Bundy's actual execution, you can read it in the book. Kathy describes it at length in here. So I will not be getting into that. While I get to the next part, let's see where y'all are in the chat. That must have been torture for the victims and the victims' families. All the deals. Oh my gosh, absolutely. I can't even imagine. Kathy doesn't, I mean, Kane, you know, you read this book. She doesn't get into, I think, the emotional roller coaster each time would have had on her. It's just one of those, all right, he was supposed to be executed. Okay, there was another day. Whether she just truly was at a point in her life where she was like, I'm moving forward, just when it happens, happens. I don't know, but you don't read like from her like this, oh my God, it was delayed. And it was now that, you know, so on and so forth. But she doesn't really get into that. But yeah, all of the victims' families and stays of execution aren't just unique to this case. It's just so many others that, again, what the victims' families go through when you get to the point where you're like, okay, the person who harmed my loved one is finally going to be executed. You emotionally get to prepare for that. And then, no, actually, no, stay of execution. Can't even imagine. So now Ted Bundy was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. The phone rang. And Kathy goes into the kitchen, answers the phone, and was told that the execution was completed. Ted Bundy was dead. She told Scott, quote, "He's gone," end quote. Kathy describes bursting into tears, and Scott held her while she cried. Kathy says she was not crying for herself. She knew she'd be fine. She cried for the victims who had died. She cried for Lisa, and she cried for Margaret. She cried for all of the women and girls who had not survived Ted Bundy. So Kathy and Scott continued to watch the news. They saw the white towel being waved, and the crowd saw that, which was the signal that Ted Bundy had been executed and was dead. Cheers from people were happening as the white hearse was driving by with Ted Bundy's corpse in it. As again, this was all video footage you guys can see on YouTube. Kathy described she was exhausted from all of the emotions that happened. She was ready to move on and wanted to move on with her day. So Kathy says, you know, this is how she survived. So she said to Scott, quote, "I'm hungry. Let's go to breakfast," end quote. And the way she says it in any interviews that you listen to her, and the way she said it when I saw her at CrimeCon, it's just, again, one of those, you go from such a heartbreaking moment to just like, all right, I need to move on with my life. Let's go. And that's just what she does. So Kathy would say, quote, "Bundy's light had finally been extinguished, but mine still burned, and I was going to make sure it burned brightly," end quote. So Kathy, Scott, and Michael ended up moving to Athens, Georgia, the summer after Bundy was executed. That summer, Kathy and Scott hoped to expand their family. She was 34 years old at this point. They wanted to have a baby together. Kathy went for an exam, and that is when the doctors found a pea-sized lump deep in her left breast. She had a biopsy done, came back, and she was going to, the results came in, she was going to have to endure chemotherapy in her life again. She had stage 2 cancer. She had a mastectomy at the same hospital, actually, where she worked. Left untreated, this cancer would have quickly metastasized to her organs and killed her. She talks about in such a hard moment. She's gone through so much, and now to experience this, she talks about how lucky she was in life, how lucky she was now at this point to go through chemo again, that she had Scott with her this time. She discusses going through chemotherapy again as now a 34-year-old woman and how she got through it. And the way she talks about how she got through it was she would say, okay, I have one chemo left. I have one chemo treatment left. And Scott would say, no, you actually have 6 more sessions. And she'd say, no, 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 no. I only have one. She knew she could get through one more. To look at it and say, I have 6 more sessions. She's like, no, I couldn't have gone through that. I looked at it as I have one more, and then she'd get through that. Okay, that's done. I have one more. And that, again, that was her way to get through it. Once Kathy recovered from chemotherapy and her surgeries, now was the point in time where Kathy and Scott wanted to expand their family and have a baby of their own. Kathy got pregnant a couple of times, but actually she kept miscarrying. And she discussed this in detail and eventually decided that she just couldn't go through this again. She describes it as she always knew she could take care of herself and be okay. But here she was, and there was nothing she could do for her unborn baby. It was too much for her. So she just said, I can't go through this anymore. So her and Scott bought a boat together, and she actually has a picture of the boat in the book. That was going to be their new thing. So Kathy, Scott, and Michael at this point end up moving to New Orleans. They were just about to enjoy a full first year in the Big Easy when Hurricane Katrina hit. She talks about surviving that, the devastation it brought to their home, and now the financial debt that it brought to them. As we know, it wasn't just Kathy and her family who experienced this. It was a whole community that experienced this. That community, to be honest, hasn't recovered the way it was prior to Hurricane Katrina. But it's just to go through all of these things, and it's just, you're reading this, you're like, no, Kathy, like, you deserve to be at a point in life where it's like, you've gone through so much already, you don't deserve another kickback like this. But she says, again, in typical Kathy Kleiner, ways of phrasing things and looking at life with her perspective, she says, quote, it wasn't the first time my life had been suddenly knocked off, and I knew that rebuilding would take time, and it happened in slow increments. And then one day I would look back and realize my struggle was over, end quote. Just as a reader, it's like these ebbs and flows of like, oh my God, no, I can't believe she's going through this again as it goes down. And then she just has these positive ways of looking at it with just such hope. And I'm going to get through this. That is just so inspirational reading it. In 2018, Kathy did a story on surviving Ted Bundy for Rolling Stone magazine. Her son, Michael, was now an adult at this point. He was shocked. He had no idea that his mother had been attacked by serial killer Ted Bundy. He called her after he read the article. She says his voice was shaking and he was upset. He just kept saying, quote, you were so normal, end quote. It's just, oh my gosh. And this is where she says it was never a secret. It just wasn't discussed. She had moved on in her life. But I can even imagine that's how he learned it. And again, it's like he kept saying, you were so normal. Like, Mom, you were just so normal. But, oh man. So by December 2019, at this point in life, Kathy and Scott are now grandparents. Kathy says she was a grandmother who has lived many happy decades. She felt like it was time that she now spoke up. The narrative had been long distorted, and it was time someone corrected the record. Quote, I am one of the few Bundy survivors, and I thought I had the strength to speak up, end quote. So Kathy did an interview for 48 hours. This is where the producers arranged for her and Sheriff Ken Casares to meet in person. She hadn't seen him in almost 40 years. So she talks about meeting with Ken after all this time. And this was such a powerful point in the book. So again, the book is kind of winding down and it still has all these truly powerful points in it. And I do want to read a passage from that. I just want to, again, keep an eye on the chat with you guys. What a strong and well-adjusted woman she must be. I know, Kane, it's like you're absolutely spot on, but even with that, I'm just like, are there any other words to describe it? Because I feel like that still doesn't even do her justice. Kathy's just in a league of her own. She really, really is. She's one of those, like, after hearing her speak at CrimeCon, like seeing her, she's talking about the book, but like seeing her in person and how she's describing it, you just look at her and you're just like, for me personally, I just felt like she's the type of person I would love to have in my life. Somebody who's just so positive, and that positive light of, you know what, something's tough right now. Let's take it head on, and here's what we're going to do. And because there are not many people like her. There really aren't. And yeah, it's just, she's just one of those, I don't even know if there are words to describe the type of woman that she is, really, because I feel like even the best of words I could describe wouldn't do her justice. So take a sip of water before I just read through this next passage in her book that I want you guys to hear. So again, she now meets up with Ken Cassars, and what she says is, quote, "He told me he remembered being called at 3:30 a.m. and hearing, 'Sheriff, wake up, we have an incident.' He arrived at the Chi Omega house in time to see the paramedics carrying out my stretcher. He saw my split face and blood-drenched nightgown, and he told me he thought, 'Poor thing, I don't think she will live.' Ken was still at the Chi Omega house when the emergency call came from the duplex on Dunwoody. The victim's housemates had found her in bed, bloody, unconscious. Ken told me in that moment he thought, 'What are the chances this is the same perpetrator?' It was amazing to hear his thoughts on the investigation in the trial for the first time. It was wonderful to finally speak with someone who was as personally invested in the case as I had been." End quote. There's more to this meeting, but that to me was the most powerful point in that passage that I wanted to share with you guys. So as we wind the book down, towards the end of the book, Kathy talks about how the idea formed for her to write this book and how that process went. So she takes us through that. She also gives an entire appendix in the back of the book. So I just want to kind of show you guys, for example, each section is of a victim. They get their own full section. And again, Kathy really wanted it put out there that there's enough about Ted Bundy. There's not much about the victims. She made sure that every victim, we all knew who they were, their likes, what they did in life, where were they in their journey at life at this point before running into Ted Bundy. And it really just puts more to each victim than the typical like one sentence or two sentences that all of the victims are kind of crammed into in most other Ted Bundy books. Kathy also gives an entire appendix after that about setting the record straight in regards to the victims. So any kind of misinformation that's out there that has been floating around again for decades, she again sets the record straight for all of that. There's a third appendix at the end of the book, and it's how to honor the women and girls who lost their lives to Ted Bundy. And a lot of this involves correcting the Bundy legacy and changing how people talk about him. And she gives quite a few examples on how people can do that. So over an hour and a half in, that is the description of the book. I know I kind of gave a lot of information in this, but I only gave you guys a bit. Like, there's so much more in this. I cannot recommend this book enough. Again, you're not going to find another book like this. Somebody who survived the attack and is giving not only their story of surviving it, but that's just a part of Kathy's life. She experienced so much more: childhood lupus, stage 2 breast cancer later on in life, again, with so many other bumps along the way. But Ted Bundy was just a fraction of her life. She goes into that. So you're going to learn about that from a survivor perspective in detail, but you're going to get so much more about her. You read this book, and at the end, you really get a full sense of her entire life, all of the ups, all of the downs, and how she's navigated through her entire life. And there's that saying where, I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, but at heart, you're still at your core the same person. You just grow and evolve. And that's Kathy. You see how she grows and evolves from a child to high school to college to her 30s. Now she's older, a grandmother. But she, at the very core of who she is, she's still that fierce, strong, takes everything head on person that's never changed. And you read that from the book jumps into when she's 12 years old with lupus. And you just see her strength and her character come through. Just such a powerful woman. I cannot recommend this book enough. I know I said it. I will say it again. Everybody should pick this up. Again, it's a great read. You're not going to find anything else like it. It gives you a different perspective on the case. There are hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands, of Ted Bundy books out there. Not a single other one is like this. Kathy has done so many interviews. You could find them on YouTube or, depending on what podcast you listen to. If you just search in Kathy Kleiner interview Ted Bundy, whole bunch will come up. So you can hear her story also. A lot of what is in the book, she talks about in her interviews. So you can hear that as well in interviews. But again, you're maybe get like an hour and a half, maybe less, maybe more interview where, she sums up a lot of the details of the book, but do yourself a favor and get the book and read all that for yourself. I've summed up a lot for you guys. Do yourself a favor and get this and read all of the details, because there's so much in between moments that I just couldn't capture all of it for you guys. And it would really do you a service to read that and read her story and her journey for yourself. So that is the book recommendation and book review I have on, again, A Light in the Dark, Surviving More Than Ted Bundy by Kathy Kleiner Rubin. So check that out. Amazon, all of that good stuff. If you guys have Barnes and Nobles in your area, check it out there. Wherever your local bookstore is, check it out and get yourself a copy. You will not regret it. Renee says, I just got it on Audible. Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. Let me know what you think about it after. And you're going to get a totally different experience from it because, again, I know some people are into Audible. Some people I'm more old school with the book. I'm too old fashioned. I can't do Audible, but it's just such a different experience. So I'm really curious what your takeaway is from it, Renee, after you read it. So let me know. And I know you will let me know. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining me for tonight's episode. If you have any questions or comments on this book, please let me know. Leave it in the comments of this video, and I will definitely get back to you on that. Blue Renee, I'll report in. Thank you. So other than that, later in the week will be another true crime and chill discussion. And if you're all a follower in true crime this week, you know what cases we're going to be talking about. So tune in so you don't miss that. Anyway, everybody have a good rest of your evening and a great rest of your week. And until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.